Thanks for tuning in to another episode of We Are Extension, a podcast hosted by K-State Extension, Douglas County. Throughout our episodes, we'll showcase all aspects of our work. This week, we're focusing on our community development program. We're proud to engage this community in all of our program areas, and this week, we're excited to share our efforts in building community capacity. Thanks for being here with us. We're glad you're interested. Now let's get started. Welcome back. We're excited to have you here with us again. And I am happy to present one of my favorite people, a close partner. First, I'm Marlin Bates. I'm the County Extension Director and Community and Economic Development Agent. Here with me today is Tara Markley, who does the same job that I do over in Johnson County. So Tara is the Johnson County Extension Director and Community and Economic Development Agent.
Thank
Welcome.
you for letting me be here.
Well, thanks for being here. So Tara and I have a relatively long work history together. We've obviously got a lot in common with the work that we do, but certainly I think it's something else that we have in common is just our appetite for helping to, yes, you heard it in the intro, build community capacity, but also build the capacity of the staff that we have and build a network of extension throughout our communities. And I think a piece of that is also just like an investment that we make in the professional development of our peers. So Tara, you and I back, 5 months ago maybe, we were at a regional meeting in Iowa where we hosted a facilitated discussion with peers from all over the north central region of the country. And we were just trying to get a sense from people who have jobs like ours where they're running local units of cooperative extension to just kind of get a sense of like, what is it that they need? Like what would make sense in a toolkit of sorts for a job like that to make their jobs easier. And so first, I just want to say I really appreciate your willingness to co-facilitate that with me. If you know Tara, you know she's an excellent facilitator. And also just, thanks for being there to help hear all those things that we heard. I think that was a good entree into the evolution of the topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is partnerships. So you submitted a proposal for our K-State Extension Annual Conference, which we just recently had, where we were going to have a similar facilitated conversation, but really just about cultivating impactful partnerships. So can you tell me a little bit about why that was intriguing to you?
Sure. Thank you, Marlin. The fact of having a facilitated conversation at conferences, I think, is more meaningful for folks as opposed to just a talking head, here's my slides, think about this, but engaging the audience because everybody's an expert in their field. And so engaging and getting folks to share their experiences. So coming back from the Iowa conference, looking at our statewide annual conference, they asked for proposals for, one of it was resilience, but also partnerships. So I thought, how cool would it be if we had our folks around the table talking about impactful partnerships? What does that look like? We can't do our work in the communities. We're in 105 counties, and we can't do that work unless we have those partnerships, but really having a meaningful and facilitated conversation around what does that look like? Because we all struggle with it as well. So what's the strengths and what's the challenges? So that's kind of why I put it out there and they accepted it. And then I asked you to help me facilitate it because we're a team.
Well, and I had a lot of fun with that session. You know, one of the things that we realize is when you're doing a session like that, what you want to kind of what your gut tells you is like, we should talk about like sort of why impactful partnerships are important. And I think, maybe I'm just far enough along in my career that it's just like, isn't that a no-brainer? That's just common sense, right? Because what you just said, like we can't do our jobs in isolation. We cannot do this alone. And especially if part of what we're attempting to achieve is, systemic and community-wide change. There's no one organization that's going to do that. So to me, that's a no-brainer, but I really like the idea of kind of thinking through, a little more tactically. Like if you really break it down, like why are partnerships important? There's actually some really good fodder in there. But what we asked our participants was to help us develop a word cloud. And so we just asked them, like, what is it that defines the strength of a partnership? And were you surprised at all by the terms that showed up on the word cloud on the screen?
I wasn't. I think the one word that was pretty the two words really was trust and communication for what a strength of a partnership. And in my mind, that synergy piece, someone put in that word, and synergy is a really great word kind of all encompassing, that to have true synergy, you've got to be able to trust. And that's a hard word, especially when you're looking at other organizations coming to the table with different goals, which that was another piece, was around that shared common goal piece. But having that synergy around trust, communication, and also those clear goals, I think those were the ones that popped out, as well as patience. And I think that piece really around the strength of the partnership, we know when we work with folks that it takes time. And so doing stuff quickly is hard to do. Those were the things that came out around strength of partnerships, which was really exciting to engage in the conversation with the group about what does that word trust mean to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's important too, in those sort of conversations that we had with those colleagues in Manhattan, it's important to note that, like, yeah, when there is a high level of trust, that is a strong relationship. But there are partnerships where trust isn't strong. And so that is kind of like a continuum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, where there's little trust, maybe the partnership's just not that strong. And so, I've latched on to, for several years now, a graphic from the Tamarack Institute. And I shared this with you again. I'm sure I've done it before as we were prepping for our session. And, I'm so glad that you also kind of were like, yeah, we need to make sure that we share that with the group as well, because there is some truth to this understanding. And you saw one of the words that popped up on the word cloud about the strengths, or what defines the strength of a partnership. Just lack of ego was something that somebody put. And so what that says to me is like, well, people need to let go of turf, really. And so turf is one of the things that's on this graphic from the Tamarack Institute that just kind of displays the various sort of like moving all the way from competition on the left side, where turf, is abundant.
Mm-hmm.
That's an abundant consideration, all the way over to like integration, where turf really isn't, but trust is. Trust is huge. It's a huge consideration. And then, the several sort of steps in between. And I think it was helpful for me, but also maybe the participants, to just kind of envision in my own mind, like some of the partnerships that we have here. I can probably think of, several organizations to sort of pigeonhole into each one of those along a continuum of collaboration. And so I think that was helpful, and certainly just understanding that, like, just because something defines the strength of a partnership, it also can be an indicator of the weakness of a partnership.
And I think it's important, for when you talk about the continuum Tamarack has presented, is that knowing that it's a progression, and that it's okay if you're in the cooperation state and you still want to get to that integration state, that here are some steps and ideas to think about and be strategic. I think that's one of the goals that I wanted out of the session with our colleagues, is that we have to be strategic in how we work with partnerships, and we can't take them for granted. And so really looking at that spectrum of all the way from turf and competing to, we got to trust folks, and we got to work together.
Well, and I think one of the things, certainly when you think about organizations that communicate, just to be aware of what each other is up to, that's definitely a partnership. It's maybe not the most developed or most highly developed state of a partnership, but I think there's a lot of different places within that continuum. One of the other questions that we asked our participants, which is really, I think, the meat and potatoes of the conversation, was, like, what are the difficulties? Like, what are the roadblocks? Like, what is it that keeps you from developing or maintaining impactful partnerships? And so, I thought we had a pretty great word cloud going with the first question, and then we had like 3 times more contributions on the second word cloud, which I thought was great. But that's a testament, I think, to, like, people kind of take things for granted, and they do. So whenever you say, like, well, what is it that defines the strength of a partnership? You get a handful, whatever. We got 20 words maybe. Let's flip that around and just say, what are the challenges of starting or maintaining a partnership?
They went wild.
Twice as many contributions to our word cloud. So I'm curious, like, what struck you on that question?
Well, of course, the biggest one on that one was time. The time for maintaining and starting those partnerships. That was the obvious one. But then the other underlying one was, you mentioned ego, and that who gets credit. And I think that piece around how you navigate those conversations with your partnerships, of who gets that credit and how do you get past those egos or that turf competition piece when you're working to maintain those. And so the personalities, the politics, and that who gets credit, I feel all wraps up into that ego piece, which I thought was really interesting. And we know that's true. And so how do you get past those steps?
Yeah. And I think somebody had mentioned the term altruistic or altruism, and just kind of that idea of giving with no expectation of getting, right? And I think what a wonderful position to be in if you can embody that, and what a wonderful way to approach a potential partnership than to do it through generosity. I feel like that's a beautiful thing to do. I think some of the other roadblocks still get in the way, right? Even having the right contact within a certain demographic or geographic population that you're trying to partner with. But if you can authentically show up with generosity, you don't have to be wholly and entirely altruistic, right? Because a partnership is and should be a give and take. But I think we're uniquely positioned in Extension here to provide at least some demonstration of how we can altruistically approach partnerships. So I think that is sort of one of my major takeaways, because I feel like there's a lot that I was able to weave together in thinking about, like, how do our efforts in partnership really translate to impact?
Right.
Which I think is kind of, the whole point, right?
Mm-hmm.
We want to make sure that we're creating a positive impact on the communities and the people that we're working with in Extension. And in order to do that, we understand we can't do all that alone. So in order to do that successfully, we have to have impactful partnerships.
And I think that piece with Extension as well is that we bring that unbiased. And so we come to the table and we don't necessarily have that unbiased mindset of, okay, what's going to be the best to reach our collective good? And being able to facilitate those conversations with our partners, I think gives us an advantage when that turf is not as prevalent for us within the community.
Yeah. And I think rightfully so, right? I think organizations, agencies will have, some inability to fully trust or to act altruistically, or maybe they do latch on to a little bit of protectionism around turf-related issues because they've got to protect the investments that come into their organizations and the donors that provide the funding for those organizations. So it is a different dynamic in the public sector and the private sector. And that was a little bit of what we discussed the other day. So, yeah, I think, the other thing I want to make sure that we touch base on is, when we were in Iowa, we met a colleague from Michigan State University Extension who had developed or has developed a partnership playbook.
Correct.
And you latched onto that pretty quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kelly Kiernan, who's out of Michigan State, she had shared this partnership playbook, Strategies for Effective Collaboration. And it really talked everything from what is a partnership, benefits, types of those partnerships, to the length, short, medium, long term, how to initiate that partnership, how to participate in partnership meetings, all the way to the follow-up emails, all the way to, okay, what happens when the partnership has run its course? How do we discontinue this partnership? Which I think is important for folks to realize, because those are your community partners. And if it's run its course, that's great. That means you've done your job. Hopefully.
Sure.
And so,
Right.
So this playbook really, it's got a lot of bullet points and questions for you to consider when you're thinking about partnerships and what that might look like.
Yeah. So I think just kind of how we tied that in to our session at our annual conference for Extension in Kansas was, what we need to do is just make sure that the people who are here as a part of our facilitated discussion around impactful partnerships, is they leave here with a plan. Mm-hmm. So like you podcast listeners, you may be thinking, what am I supposed to do with this information? Here it is. We asked participants to come up with sort of short, medium, long-term goals. Think of a partner. Maybe it's a partner you already have as an organization or in your business, and maybe it's somebody that you need to or want to broker a partnership with. So think of that partner, whoever they may be, existing or desired, and just kind of sketch out a little game plan. How are you going to develop this partnership and understand first and foremost that it begins with a relationship?
Correct.
And so that's a personal connection. Those interpersonal relations are incredibly important whenever you're trying to pull these things together. So what we asked our colleagues to do was kind of sit down and think, what is it you're going to do next week specifically to nurture a partnership or this specific partnership? And then what are you going to do within the next 30 days? And then what are you going to do within the next 90 days? Really, where do you want to go? What are you hoping for? Mm-hmm. Maybe don't be too prescriptive because you don't have control of the entire dialogue, right?
Correct.
I'm just curious, do you feel like that's a reasonable strategy for the colleagues that we were talking to recently, or for people who are listening to us talk right now?
Yeah, I think, when you've got to take baby steps, right? You've got to just gradually build up to that. And so that 10, 60, and 90 day, we didn't really know how that was going to work with our colleagues. We said, let's try this, see if this works. And several folks gave us examples. Another colleague came up to me afterward and says, okay, can you help me be accountable for this? And she walked me through through her plan. She's like, do I have permission to do this? And I said, yes, do it, make it happen. And so I think it's also those that chose partnerships that were new. I think they're and it could be an established one too. There's some fear when you start pushing and wanting to have that dialogue, because not everybody's comfortable with initiating that. So I think it's kind of a SMART goal mentality, right? Give us some measurables and then hold us accountable. And I think that's the piece we added into this as well, as we've offered up a couple accountability check-ins with our peers in a couple weeks to see where they're at or if they have any more questions. So I like the model.
Yeah, I do too. I really like that extra bit, right? So there's the sort of call to action of, like, let's put you to work here, because you're not just here to kind of wax philosophical about partnerships. You're here to do your job well. And in order to do that, you have to have impactful partnerships. So who's it going to be? Who do you need to develop as a partnership? And then, like, what are the steps you're going to do to make that actually happen? Because I think it's so easy, because it is, some people are more extroverted than others. So they're going to be a little bit more attuned to making that call or having that coffee or whatever, that first step is. But I think a lot of people need a little bit more help, because this is the sort of thing that really does hit a back burner, and it'll stay there unless it's, somebody sticks it on the front burner for them.
Right. I think it was a easy, digestible format that folks saw, oh, I can do this and I should do this. I think that was the piece I really wanted folks to, like, you should be doing this, thinking about this in a strategic manner.
Yeah, I think this is a beautiful example of just some research-based information around getting out there and making sure that people understand who you are, what you do for a living, whether you're within the cooperative extension system or outside doing literally anything else in the world, and making sure that you're an advocate for yourself and the work that you do. Not saying that you got to be a salesperson necessarily, but maybe you are in sales. And in either of those cases, part of how we grow as a society and as an economy is through collaboration. And those collaborative efforts require strong and impactful partnerships. And so I love that you presented this idea to our conference committee and that they selected it and that you invited me to join you. And so I reciprocated with the invitation for you to join me here today. Tara Markley from Johnson County Extension, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Marlin. I appreciate the conversation. This is good stuff.
Appreciate all that you do. Mm-hmm. And for those of you listening, think through those partners that you think you might like to strengthen, or the partnerships that you might need to have within your own life, and take concrete steps to pursue them. If you need help, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Thank you for listening to K-State Extension Douglas County's podcast. We hope you tune in again for not only more research-based information and resources you can trust, but also good conversation. Until next time.